Elizabeth.
Should we give it a start? Okay, so welcome all to this panel. I'm Elizabeth. I work in URAC Research. For those who don't know the institution, it's in the very north part of Italy. And I work there in the Institute for Comparative Federalism and Regionalism. And we do comparative studies, as the name says, especially from the perspective of comparative constitutional law and the perspective of political science. So that are the major disciplines we deal with. I thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate this panel and this roundtable, because I think it's a very, very important actually topic, and I think it's very useful for all of us basically to exchange and just listen to the ideas of how others approach research funding, because there is no magic formula to it. And it always drives me a bit crazy when I basically have to approach different research grant schemes, because it always requires you to basically adapt first of all your research ideas very often also, and second of all also your whole bureaucratic apparatus behind, which is not easy to deal with. So I think it's very interesting just to share the opinions on this. It's obvious that we all perceive and we all interpret the problems of accessing research funding very differently. There are many reasons for that, I would say. Two I mentioned just shortly as an introduction. So first, we're all in different career paths. So being in different career paths means that you are inevitably linked to different research fundings, to the needs, and also linked to different possibilities actually to accessing certain research grant schemes. Like early career academics might look for independent research grants to build up their own research program as independent investigators at first time, and then at the second stage they might look for research grant schemes allowing them to transition in their career, so at the later stage. While I mean more experienced academic scholars might be confronted with the challenges that come along with the bigger, huge, big international or European collaborative research grants, which obviously pose, again, very different challenges. So whatever, let's say, the opinions we all have on this, it is crucial and it is fact that access to research funding is getting more competitive. And the second reason why we all perceive and interpret the problem in a different way, I would say, is because we also interpret the meaning and the relevance of social science in a different way, vis-a-vis the complexity we study. So with the different interpretations we have on the significance of social science, obviously we also approach the topic of accessing research funding in different ways. So these are just a very preliminary introductory thoughts on the topic from my side. But now, and most importantly, I would like to briefly introduce the panelists. And I thank you all from the very beginning that you accepted to share all your thoughts on the topic and to bring in the experiences you deal with right now or in past. So all the panelists have been and are successful bid winners. They have approached different research fundings successfully at different levels in different stages of their career. And And now I basically go through each of the panelists just to table the context they're working. So welcome Timofey, Timofey again. He works at the Queen's University Belfast and is currently affiliated also to Europe Research, among others. And he's interested especially to get research funding for studying social and institutional change in the post-communism area, and investigates different issues like non-discrimination, minority protection, migration, civil society, and many more, just to give you a sense. And he has, among others, extensive experience with the Economic and Social Research Council, UK's largest organization for funding research on social sciences, and also with the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Fund, which supports studies that address the root causes of conflict and injustice. We also have among the panelists Paolo Dardanelli. Welcome also to Paolo. Paolo works at the University of Kent, explores many questions linked with the causes and consequences of the territorial structures of political systems. His research has been funded by the UK's Economic Research Council, by the British Academy, by the Swiss National Science Foundation, by the Leverhulme Trust, by different foundations such as the Fritz Thyssen, such as the Konrad Adenauer. He has been working with the Forum of Federations and, for example, to mention another one, with the James Madison Charitable Trust, just to outline some of the different institutions that can grant research funding. I also welcome Sarah Lieberman to this roundtable. Hi, Sarah. She works at the Canterbury Christ Church University in Kent, and she researches and publishes widely on space policy. She discusses the place in security, military, economic structures, and culture. And for example, a few years ago, she has won a funding from the Independent Social Research Fund to conduct research on the international political economy of space. So, and finally, a very warm welcome also to Ada Charlotte Regelmann. She's a project manager at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, located, if I'm correct, in the foundation's Brussels office. And the foundation, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, is a center for critical thinking and research, both in Germany and internationally. Since 1999, the foundation has been able to grant many scholarships to students and PhD students, researchers, scholars from Germany and abroad. And the foundation itself also undertakes a wide range of political education projects, where the foundation obviously then enters into contact with academics, with scholars, with practitioners of all over the world. So we basically have in this panel different scholars at different career stages, but we also have Ada Charlotte Regelmann, who can bring in also the other side a bit as a project manager and can be a bit this interlinkage also between the two sides of getting funded and getting the research results out to the world, let's say. So this have been my preliminary thoughts on this. And I do hope that these introductions of the persons also already help to get a sense what we want to basically do in this round table. I would like now to invite each of the panelists basically to come in and to specify a bit better than I did their roles, whether their positions are based on certain research schemes, and to do basically coming with a first statement on their approach to the topic of accessing research funding, and by contextualizing it within the biggest challenge they deal with currently, for example. So I'll go with the order as on the program. I guess this is okay, and yeah, I'll ask basically Timofey to come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Very good to be here and to share some of the insights, I think, from what we as scholars usually have after receiving funding from different sources. And I think in reflection on the overall concern that many of the younger scholars particularly would have when applying for research funding, one of the fundamental issues, I think, to start off and kick off this conversation is accessing or seeking funding is an inherent goal. So everyone engaged in that would be doing this for different reasons, but there are also additional reasons that sit with the grant givers. So why and what do they fund? And this is the fundamental starting point for all of your considerations when reaching out to grant givers with your research ideas. Depending on who you address, there will be significant differences in the layout of the application, the focus of the application, the parts of an application that you need to submit with that. And in my past experience, I think in applying to several funders, an important starting point has been to pay attention to the budget that you can apply for. So although no research grant application is successful if you have a crappy idea, you always need to frame your ideas not only in the sense of acceptable and for the audience that will later read your papers or potentially your books, participate in your research activities, but you need to make that research idea attractive within the clear scope of grant givers' remit. So what it is that they fund is key to framing of your project application. Second step in the process is identifying the amount of funding that is available out there for you to tap. And although we do have quite considerable range of grant givers out there, some of them do not stipulate the maximum ceiling of funding that you can request, others do. So I assume Sarah will be talking about a bit more about the ISRF, where there is a clear maximum amount of money you can apply for. In Joseph Browntree Charitable Trust that I have recently applied for and been successful, there's also a maximum amount of funding that you can request. In others, such as ESRC, there is none. And I believe, Paolo, you should correct me if I'm wrong, Leverhulme has had maximum amount of funding that you can claim for certain schemes. In others, the amount of funding is so big it doesn't really matter. Why consideration of the grant giver's remit is essential? On the one hand, we do have, and from the panelists here, I think the clear distinction between those who work towards more impact-oriented projects, ESRC and research councils in the UK is the one, the stream in this regard. What this means in practice, that is, any research that you plan to conduct for those on the projects that you apply with to those research councils should have some practical implications on the ground. That is, it has to involve stakeholders, whether it's policymakers, NGOs. You have to review some or provide feedback to officials of various sorts and types. And this effectively means that your research will not be sitting on the shelf once it is complete, it will go out and be read by those who make decisions. While on the other hand, there are research funding opportunities that put less of an emphasis on the impact work and are much more concerned with changing society, such as Joseph Rowntree Foundation that I have been applying to, but also Paula will talk about Leverhulme Trust, which has a definitive statement in their description page that they don't want to see any impact work. They want to see advancement in science and research. And so does ISRF, I remember, as far as I remember. So these two fundamental differences, so either you are contributing to policy change, societal change, or you contributing to change in terms of the academic work, are also essentially are foundational for your consideration how you frame your project. So your project application might be innovative for research, but if it's hard to turn it around into policies, you say that we need to deal away with elections or deal away with multi-level governance, for that matter, now that we have Elizabeth and Paula sitting here. These might be useful ideas, but you should not be going with them to ESRC or research councils, because these are impossible to implement on the ground. Whereas if you think of research applications that need considerable work with policymakers or stakeholders on the ground, NGOs, and provide an advisory capacity to feed in, I guess, policy development, governmental policy development, then Leverhulme Trust or Joseph Rowntree Foundation or ISRF would not be appropriate funders there. So where does that leave you in that sense once you open up your new Word document and you try to start your research application? First of all, and I think essential in all of this, is the clarity for yourself of the purpose of what you are doing. So in a sense, identifying either research audience or policymaking audience or societal audience from the outset of your application is key. And that would allow you also to frame the entire discussion that comes after it. So by means of justifying why these audiences might be interested in supporting your research, why this research is salient for contemporary political societal processes is the secondary concern for many research funders, but it is that is useful to throw in your application description, because anything that has a long-haul effect on societal political process is interesting, but is probably not a priority for funding in many research council research councils. It is again different in funders who are supporting fundamental research and try to move science forward. Now, once you settle in and you have identified the audience that you're trying to speak to with your research project, the second important point, and this is where consideration of the budget available to you, is how are you going to do it? So what do you need to do to convince people, for example, academics, that your research application, that your research project is moving discussion in a discipline forward, or policymakers that your research findings will be moving policy into more responsible, more responsive direction? Now, these are the questions that are specific to individual research project, but in reflection of my own work in the ESRC grant, I think it is useful to see through the structure of the application itself. So usually the research councils require you to provide a relatively concise review of the state of the field, literature review, and outline the plan of your work for the duration of the project, and outline responsibilities of all people involved in the project. That document in itself is only 6 pages long, and you can fiddle to a degree with the font size, but you can't fiddle with that too much. So you have to provide both the rationalization in terms of contribution to the scholarship, the outline the relevance for the policy development in society, but also you need to provide a clear roadmap for achieving your objectives. And that said, you need to also put considerable time and thought into identifying who is doing what on your project. A good idea is always not to pull off an application on your own, but think about this as a collaborative research with someone, because the more bases you can cover in saying that this is a complex issue and you need a joint expertise, and delivering on that expertise is always an asset when we think about the Research Council applications. And thinking in terms of your project as both challenging the existing academic wisdom and seeing a problem in political and social processes essentially allows you to think about the research project application as a part of a research paper. As in all research papers, what we do, we set out the dilemma that we observe. Scholarship tells us this, in reality we observe this. How do we square this problem? And this is what, in effect, we need to do when we write Research Council applications. There is a scholarship that says something. Ideally, this is an up-to-date scholarship. And then there is an up-to-date assessment of reality in politics and society. And how do you merge these two together? How do you allow academics to speak to policymakers, or the other way around? This is usually the mechanics of crafting a good research project for application for research councils. Now, in addition to this brief and 6-pager case for support, as it is called, there is a range of additional documents that research councils require. That is justification of resources. That is one of the essential components of that. There, in the space of one matter, you need to justify how you're going to spend the money that you are applying for. So it is useful to think about the timeline of the project that you suggest, the distribution of duties on your project between yourself and your colleagues, either postdocs or colleagues from other institutions, and think clearly what you need to do to get to achieve research aims that you signpost, but also to communicate those research aims clearly outwards. This can involve both outline of research, fieldwork research, well, probably more challenging these days of COVID lockdowns, but also involve communication of your research results, either by means of workshops with the stakeholders of different sorts, either policymakers or communities, but also to academic audiences, participation in conferences, organizing workshops where ideas can be put forward on the table and thrashed out, and potentially also organizing conferences where you bring similarly minded academics to debate findings of your work and move on the scholarship forward. Essentially, reaching out to people who might be interested in your work and be able to pick up or unpick your findings from your research project. Finally, an additional document that research councils would require you to submit is Pathways to Impact, it is called. That is also a relatively short document, maximum 2 pages, where you say what it is that you're going to do to achieve, to ensure that your research does not remain sitting on the shelf as it was after it is complete. What it is that you're going to do to make policymakers aware of your findings, what it is that you're going to do to ensure that your fellow academics pick up the work. And this document, in essence, outlines either your conference activities or outreach activities in the academic field, your engagement with policymakers, whether by means of workshops, seminars, you can provide podcasts or whatever, writing reports, and be as specific as you can when you write that up, because making general promises is useful, but the assessment of feasibility of your project, both in terms of research plans and delivering the results, but also in maintaining legacy of the project after it will have been completed, is what research councils assess your project on. So we can return maybe later to additional components to all of this, but just a very brief distinction from these research council applications to what I have just recently experienced with Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust application. That is the trust side of this, which means that there's someone sitting on a bag of money, and they can decide how they want to spend it. They do not need to be accountable for that money to anyone, in distinction to research councils, which effectively give you the taxpayers' money. Trusts and Joseph Rowntree particularly are concerned with ensuring equality and inclusion in society, and it is always useful to read about the background of trusts that you seek funding from, what it is their priority. They might have different tiers of funding. Joseph Rowntree, particularly in my successful application, supports work in Northern Ireland, among other parts in the UK. We have went for Northern Ireland aspects of it. The problems of Northern Ireland are rather unique in the UK context, so it is always useful to talk up the uniqueness of the problem that you're trying to address, and promise that you're not going to change the world with that. Although the charitable trusts usually want you to engage with stakeholders more and to put less emphasis on research proper, their priority is to make a difference to people with whom you work. So the more participatory research you do for trusts, the better, and thus also empowering, in a sense, those people from whom you draw the data, from whom you draw on your results. So for Joseph Rowntree, for example, it is less important to showcase that there will be a research academic paper coming out of it. It's more important to have a statement that there'll be a 5-pager outlining in clear language why this work is important. As in the case that of my project, it is about participation of female newcomers, essentially women refugees in Northern Ireland society, and their contribution to societal fabric, societal cohesion. What we have promised and have done so effectively is to say that we are not interested in achieving landslide change in Northern Ireland, but if we manage to bring 5 to 6 female refugees to events to public events where they can meet and raise their concerns with decision makers, policymakers in Northern Ireland, we will consider this to be a success, and that was sufficient enough as an output. But in order to get there, we need to get some work done, essentially. That is the description of the project. I think I'll leave it at that, and maybe in the conversation with colleagues, we will pick up a few issues from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. Yeah, surely. I guess there's a problem we all have to deal with, is that increasingly, whatever research grant we apply, we have to grasp with the question how to communicate the results to various groups. So how to disseminate the results within the scholarly segments, but also how to communicate it to the general public, and how to basically engage with the general public so that basically the research would general public to go on with the same ideas which have been found. Paolo, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So welcome to the panel, and thank you again, Elizabeth, for your generous introduction, and thank you, Timothy and Søren, for inviting me to take part in this panel. It is a pleasure to be here, and I hope the discussion today will be helpful to colleagues at different stages of their career. So what I plan to do, I'll keep it short. What I plan to do, just to say a few words about sort of research funding and my own work, as it were, in terms of how it features in my scholarly work. And then I plan to say a few words about the Liverhume, which was a sort of attached to my name on the program. So I guess people want to know a bit more about that one. Okay, so when it comes to my own work, research funding has been important. Now, I guess research funding is, can be approached in two different ways, in very broad terms. One, we can just say, well, it's such a pain to apply to these things. I mean, to be honest, I never like writing grant application. It's probably the least sort of, enjoyable aspect of my work. And primarily because obviously, research funding is increasingly competitive. I'm going to say few more words about this in a second. So the outcome is that most of the time you get rejected, and that obviously is very disappointing. And for an article, if you go an article, you submit to a journal, it gets turned down by the journal. You submit to another journal, it gets published, and then it might not be your ideal journal, but you get something out of it. When it comes to grant applications, obviously there is a degree of, recyclability of them, so you can submit to someone else. But very often you just, work for a long time on a grant application, and you don't get anything out of it. So that's very frustrating, but that's the nature of the game, unfortunately. And so I guess we've all experienced it. And if you are, in the early phase of your career, unfortunately, that's not good news, but at least you need to be aware that's the nature of the game. So I was saying, one way of approaching it to say, well, this is really a pain in the neck. On the positive side of this, of course, in the old days, people were working as individual, isolated researchers, in their office, just using books or articles and things of that kind. Of course, that sort of, period of scholarly life has arguably ended. Especially, if you work in, political philosophy, that might be still okay. But I guess for those, more in, comparative side of things, more empirical political science, that I presume most people on, members of IPSA and interested in this conference. Then of course that is not possible anymore, and grant applications and grant funding, of course, they allow you to pursue projects that you wouldn't be able to pursue otherwise. So in a way, that's the positive way of approaching it. To be able to do things that you couldn't do on your own, and you couldn't do it without funding. And increasingly, obviously also for career progression and so on, we are all asked and expected to tackle big questions, and those are very difficult to tackle on your own. So I guess that's the way, if you want to approach it. So be aware that there is I would say, an unpleasant side to applying for grants, but there is also a positive side, and there is an incentive for doing that. Now, one thing to bear in mind, that perhaps I should put now before I go into some more details, is that, of course, this all depends a lot on where you're based. So a lot of my comments will be, from a UK perspective, and Timofey also, of course, is also based in the UK. So, a lot of these comments obviously apply where, if you are in the UK. And this for the reason that, many funders, they only fund researchers based in the country. In some cases, for example, I know that some of the German funders, they fund projects that include Germany, or they fund German researchers based abroad, that sort of thing. But for example, for the UK funders, for example, the Liverhume, they are going to talk a bit more about in a second. Well, you need to be based in the UK to apply for that. So that's something to bear in mind. And also, for example, what Timofey was saying earlier about the particular way the ESSC works, that is in the UK context. So, for example, they are the equivalent of the ESSC in, let's say, Germany or other countries that don't necessarily have the same modus operandi. For example, when it comes to impact, okay, so it is very important to check. One thing that needs to be checked is, what are the eligibility criteria, so whether you can apply or not, and just thinking in terms of what is this particular sort of environment, research environment that the funder operates, okay, and whether they are to a particular country, or in some cases they are, more open to fund things. And the same, of course, goes for for the European funders, meaning EU funders, where obviously there are certain criteria. So, for example, the number of researchers from certain countries that you need to have on, and so on. So that is the general sort of caveat, as it were. So in terms of the UK, as Timofey has already said, I mean, grant funding is absolutely crucial, and increasingly so. For example, in my institution, grant funding is a key metric. When you apply for promotion, for example, is a key metric for the institution. In the UK, there is a research assessment exercise called the REF, Research Excellence Framework, and one of the criteria in the exercise where departments are evaluated and ranked. Well, not formally ranked, but then people do the ranking afterwards, as it were. So research funding is a key metric there. So it is absolutely crucial. As I say, we can look at this in from two perspectives, but it's certainly very important. I mean, in terms of challenges, I guess the most important, more common challenge that we all face is that because of this increase, and other countries have also followed it. I think the UK was a pioneer of these sort of research assessment exercises, and now other countries, for better or worse, they follow it. So increasingly there is this pressure on getting funding. So grants are increasingly competitive. You have very, very low success rate in the order of like 15% or so. So that is of course very, very problematic. And I guess, I mean, the other aspect that we need to be aware, and that is something that we need to negotiate, I guess, in our careers, is that because grant funding is so competitive, but is also important, and because certain funders, especially some of them, they have particular sort of objectives, particular agendas, and so on. There is, if you want, the risk that you apply for funding for something that you think got a better chance of being funded, rather than what you want to do from a scholarly point of view. And that again is, if you want, frustrating, because sometimes it's just ticking boxes about what people want. For example, I was saying EU funders, you need to have someone from the new member countries or whatever it is. This sort of criteria that might not make a huge amount of sense from a scholarly point of view, but they are important to the funders. And so you need to tick those boxes. And Timofey was saying earlier, for the SRC, this impact agenda and so on. So that's something, again, if you want, perhaps a bit unpleasant aspect of this, but we need to be aware of it. It's part of the game. Now, on the Liverhume, so the Liverhume is one of the largest sort of non-research councils funders in the UK, possibly even, well, in our field, I think there is the Wellcome Trust that does research on medicine and so on. I think is a bigger one, but for our purposes in the social sciences, is one of the largest, and is a charity. For those of you who have interest in sort of history, was set up by the guy who founded what is now Unilever. The multinational company that makes margarine and washing powder and that sort of stuff. So when you buy those things, you give money to the charity, so then it comes back in terms of grants. So that's good. And anyway, so is a charity, so they're not you know, bound by what the government wants to fund and so on. They're completely independent. They are a more agile, I would say, organization than the research councils. You know, they're much less bureaucratic. You know, the SSC is a bit of a monster machine. I mean, this Livium is a small office. You actually have a name that you can email, you know, a human being at the end of the line, so you can call them, you can email them. So they are less bureaucratic, a bit easier to work with, I found. They are also, as Timofey has mentioned already, they are not tied to, so this impact agenda, you know, in the UK, this comes obviously from the research councils, from the government ultimately. Now, because the Livium Trust are independent, they are not bound by that. So they're more interested in blue sky research, things that make sense from a scholarly point of view without necessarily ticking those boxes that the government want us to tick. And they are also, I guess, you know, for some of you might be, you may be interested in the fact that they are also quite open, quite welcoming of multidisciplinary research, you know, because again, you know, this is in the UK context. The research councils in the UK, they are of course aligned to, you know, specific disciplines, and so this can, you know, in some cases, depending on what kind of research people do, might be a little bit of a limitation. Okay, now that they are specifically welcoming more multidisciplinary research, so they're particularly open for that. As I said, they are not bound by what the government wants to do, so they are freer to embrace, you know, bold ideas, which, you know, make sense, with also a degree of, you know, they are aware that, you know, the more risky an idea it is for a project, the more likely also to fail. So in a way, they are less, perhaps, you know, risk averse in what they found, sorry, in what they fund, compared to, let's say, the SSC. Okay, I mean, you know, for good reason, in a sense, the SSC, as Timofey was saying, essentially gives public money to people. The Livium Trust is private money, so they can do what they like with it. So that, in that respect, you know, I found them. You know, a bit more refreshing in the way they approach funding, in the way they welcome your research project and so on. Okay, a couple of other points on this. So one is that they offer a range of different schemes, so that's quite good. They also have a range of different schemes, in particular including fellowships. So if you're doing, I was mentioning earlier that, you know, grants enable us to do things we can't do on our own, but in some cases we also want to do, you know, things that are a bit more personal. And the Livium Trust has got a range of fellowships at different career stages. So, for example, you can apply for an early career fellowship, okay, and that's a way, you know, to establish yourself and so on. So that's quite useful. So they have a range of different fundings for different career stages, which I find helpful. They have, I mean, the particular grant that I got a few years ago from Livium is actually, unfortunately, no longer available. That was called a network grant. So was it to fund a project where you were bringing in people, which was precisely what we needed to do at the time. So it was precisely a project to, you know, that was very collaborative. Unfortunately, that I'm not entirely sure why they decided to withdraw the scheme. Unfortunately, is no longer available. But they also have the standard, you know, research grant, and this one doesn't have a deadline. You can apply at any time. It's very open, as I was saying, in terms of discipline. It's very open in terms of ideas. It's not tied to a particular impact agenda and so on. And what I find also as an attractive feature is that it has got a two-stage application process. So there is an outline application first, that it doesn't take you a huge amount of time, to put in. And then, this is if this passes the first hurdle, then you can submit the full application later. So in a way, that's quite a nice way of dealing with it. I must say that the outline application is already, quite detailed, but less so than a full application, and especially when it comes to, the details about the the actual budget and so on. So that's quite useful, quite time effective, as it were, in terms of putting in an idea and say, okay, this is, broadly speaking, is what we want to do. Is this of interest to the trust? And if they say yes, then you already know that, because there is, of course, a filtering process at that stage. If you are past that stage, then you know already that there is a degree of interest there. So that sort of can be helpful in terms of planning. Well, I think that is probably the basics of what I wanted to say. I'm of course very happy to come back on specific questions, but I'll close it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paolo, for these additional inputs and complementary inputs. I'll just pick up 3 points, basically, to throw in also some grants we at the EUREC Research often work with, to throw in some non-UK based grant schemes before handing over again also to Sarah and to most probably a UK perspective. You have been talking about also the difficulty of finding grant schemes that allow for multidisciplinarity. To a certain extent. At the European Union level, we experienced that for the big funding schemes, multidisciplinarity becomes like a real precondition. So at the European Union level, within the various big research lines, call it Horizon 2020, whatever you want to call it, multidisciplinarity is really challenging the different segments within social sciences to come together, actually. So it's the opposite challenge to a certain extent. And then I also would like to pick up your thoughts on you called them network grants, because it's a pity from what I hear that actually they don't have any more the line of network grants, because I do think it's at whatever career stage we are as single researchers, it's really a pity that there are not so many network grants out there, because they serve exploratory ideas. So they really can actually create then the networks to go down further research avenues. Again, just to throw in another scheme, which is highly competitive and very rather new, actually very new at the European Union level, for example. There's this huge network grant scheme, which is called RISE, which basically requires you to write up the state of the art in the sense of a literature review and so on and so forth, as we heard it from Timothy. And then it requires you also to create an international network on a certain topic. And it is basically a pure network grant in the sense that it primarily finances secondments. It finances secondments between academics and practitioners, and the other way around. So that's just another example I wanted to throw in. And I fully agree that that the more the different research fundings actually apply this two-stage the better it is actually also for scholars, because it really helps you a lot. If one doesn't have that many possibilities to share opinions during the writing up of a grant proposal, then this two-stage application process is really helpful. Just a few comments by myself, and to throw in some grant schemes from the European Union, and I hand it over back to the panelists and to Sarah. Thank you.
I have to take a 10-minute break because Soren, who's organised this panel and organised me to be on it, also organised for me to do an introductory, introduce somebody to a lecture for our first year students at 10 o'clock and at 11 o'clock. So I will be back, but if Ada could go next in terms of the introductory statement, that would be most helpful to me, and I can come back afterwards. But literally, our friend Dr. Kyle has double booked me for this morning, and he said I would be perfectly capable of doing both. So,
well, not to worry, because Soren has also double booked himself on the program twice. So.
Yeah, excellent, Sarah.
You know, so I think the thing is, if he can be in two places at once, he assumes that, you know, everyone can be in two places at once. I will rejoin you probably at 10 past, 11 once I've done this introductory part for my first years. I do apologize, but, you know, take it up with Soren. I'll see you soon.
Excellent, Sarah. So let me hand over and invite immediately Ada. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Okay, yeah, I would like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to this panel and giving me the opportunity to speak about sort of different type of funding as part of this broader discussion about research funding. And also thanks to both Elisabeth and Timothy for your introductions, which I think both sort of framed in a good way what I'm gonna speak about, and it will be quite different from what Paolo has been talking about, obviously. So you put me on the programme with the task to speak about political foundations and NGOs. I'm not sure I can do that. I'll speak primarily about the work of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, but I think that what I have to say is applicable to the other, at least the other German political foundations, political education foundations, and to some extent obviously holds for NGOs or even other sort of stakeholders that give out smaller grants as well. So as you've already mentioned a couple of times, that there are those large German political education foundations that are affiliated with the major German political parties, basically those that are represented in the Bundestag. However, these foundations were affiliated with these parties, but independent of them. So it's not, basically, we're not doing work for them. We critically accompany the work, we feed into their expertise and knowledge, but we set our projects and our work programme independently. With regard to Paolo, we've already heard about one other foundation, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, which is affiliated with the Conservative Party. You might have come across the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is affiliated with the Social Democrats and so on. So the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation won't surprise you, it's affiliated with the German Left Party. And I think this is already an important point to stress, because we are, in a way, of course, partisan. We're not party, but we're partisan. We come with a specific political programme and emphases, and for people working with us, there should be a match between what your research is looking at, so in terms of specific topics, and also with regard to any recommendations perhaps that might come out of that research. However, in general, all the political foundations are committed to civic political education broadly, and work on those topics that we consider most relevant amongst current political issues. So with regard to our work, for example, like speaking from my own expertise, I work on democracy issues and feminism primarily, also on working conditions. Colleagues work on climate, trade, migration, etc. Now, how are we organised? So the political foundations, they all have their office in Germany, kind of the main office. They all work at the regional level in the German states, and they have international offices. So I work for the Brussels office. We have a particular geographical remit, and we work primarily on the Western Europe, what you might call Western European countries, from Scandinavia down to Italy. And overall, the RLS has about 30 offices globally on all continents except Australia. So depending on your regional interest and expertise of your research, you would look into working with offices from that particular region. So the type of work we're doing is a mix of organising the organisers, so working with activists, in particular grassroots and movements, grassroots activists and movements. We're also an international network, and we work with a different range of actors, including politicians, political actors, trade unions, other think tanks, and academics. And we're ourselves also sort of think tanks, but compared to more traditional types of think tanks, like say the Centre for European Policy Studies in Brussels, we don't have the capacity to conduct research on our own. So what we do instead is we commission research. And this is often linked to publications, but not always. And it is this context, I think, that is the most relevant for any researchers to get in touch with us. I wanted to stress the point that what we're doing is not research funding. We're not, like the Liverpool Trust, for example, sponsoring research as such, and certainly not blue sky research, blue sky thinking. We're interested in results. We're a stakeholder in that sense, and we would like to see, recommendations and kind of expertise coming out of your research, framed in perhaps in slightly less academic tone, and more attuned to the general public, and obviously to activists and political actors. So those are our target groups that we work with and that we kind of try to feed our work into. The other important thing to stress is that we don't do open calls for research as such, but we decide that we want to work on a certain topic, and then we publish specific calls for specific projects. And so any researcher wishing to work with us would respond to a specific call. Just to give you a couple of examples, so yesterday morning we had a panel as part of this conference that was related to a book project that we'd recently done a call for on the crisis and future of democracy. So we brought together a couple of authors for this panel, So the call was specifically for an edited volume. We posed a certain set of questions that we wanted applicants to engage with, and we also set the timeline, and we are also engaged as project managers, engaged in discussing these projects and bringing them forward towards publication. And in that sense, it is commissioned work. We are the client and the researcher would be the contractor. And it's not as kind of, yeah, open-end research as you would have with a more kind of research-oriented funding or grant. Now, related to this is also that we're not to bring this into context. The German political foundations, political education foundations, work with taxpayers' money. So our funding is based on the respective parties' share or representation in the German Parliament. And the funding is channeled through the German ministries, primarily the Foreign Affairs and the International Development Ministries. But at the same time, it's not government funded. It's also, so we're not doing what government wants or what the ministries want, but we are bound by the guidelines, which, especially for project partners, can sometimes be a bit difficult to navigate. However, for researchers that work with us, it's mainly quite straightforward what we expect of them. However, it means that we're audited by the ministries, and that we do have to abide by very strict guidelines and rules. Now, what does that mean for the process? So typically you would have a certain call for papers, call for tenders. These tend not to be so we don't have templates as the ones that Timothy and Paolo spoke about. So basically you're quite free to write your own application in a way that you think is useful. But what I would stress is that applicants should look very closely at what the project wants, and also which foundation you're applying to. So same topic with RLS or the Konrad Adenauer Foundation might require different framing, which is obvious, I guess. So, yeah, you should look at who's your potential client in a way. You should also consider being a bit more political than you would be in a Levium trust application, for example. So dare to come from a certain perspective and dare to emphasize certain values, perhaps, like if you're working on migration or domestic workers, care chains, and so on. You might want to stress aspects of solidarity, for example, if you're applying with us. And that's okay, and that's something that we want, because we want to work with people who are like-minded and who come from a similar starting point. Nevertheless, you should also demonstrate your expertise, obviously demonstrate that you're familiar with the overall literature and so on. So in a way that is similar to other types of applications. I think I said it before, so when it comes to the process, for example, on my project, I would be working very closely with authors of reports or of more academic chapters for books. I would give a lot of feedback, briefings, and discuss with authors how to continue the work, but also how to what type of output we would consider. And I think so when it comes to questions like what's in there for you, Paolo and Timothy have already spoken a lot about outreach and impact and the importance of that, especially in the current kind of UK academia, but I think increasingly elsewhere as well. We don't want to have those books or reports sitting on the shelf either. We want to spread the results, to communicate this to a variety of audiences through book launches or through launches of reports, through engaging with political actors. Say, we might do a panel in the European Parliament with a certain committee or with representatives of a variety of parties, and we're not confined solely, for example, to the GUE-NGL, the Left Party, but we work with other representatives of other parties as well. The social media, we produce smaller things for the website. So there is a way in which I think your research could reach far more kind of a far diverse audience than you would normally reach with, say, an academic journal article that is restricted in access and so on. So what would I recommend? I think if you're interested in kind of this more impact outreach oriented work, these tend to be interesting projects that diverge a bit from the typical academic work, because you can be more political. I think you get the impression that, and it can be quite satisfying that you don't do this just for, I don't know, for a small circle of academics working on similar issues, but you can give something back to society. It is paid, so you write an article that you get some funding for, even though it's not research funding. You can obviously use it for smaller research projects, going on a field trip, interviews, and so on. And you have that outreach. I would recommend checking the websites of the various foundations, especially those that you're close to. Have a look at what regions they're working, or what foundations, what organizations work in those regions that you're working on. Check out what topics they're working on. Sign up to newsletters, follow them on Facebook and Twitter. This is where we publish our calls primarily. And yeah, also check out our work with regard to topics that might come up, or with regard to our work in general in your region, seminars and so on, just to understand a bit better how we work and what we work on, and get in touch. And sometimes project ideas come out of this type of networking as well. Okay, I finished with that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. This was fascinating because it added actually a whole bunch of information which applies to the many foundations out there. May they be in Germany, may they be in other European countries or beyond, but to my knowledge, the rationale, if you pursue work with foundations, is exactly the one you described, that the foundations look to commission some works and they might feed in the work in a bigger picture. They are actually based on as a foundation itself, ideologically speaking, and so on and so forth. So this was a fascinating overview on how these things go and how one can understand a bit better the different relations between foundations and so on and so forth. I see Sarah is back, so welcome Sarah again, and I hand immediately over to you because I also have to keep an eye on the time. Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, I won't take up too much time. I see that we're 20 past 11 already. It's amazing. These things always go so quickly, don't they? You think they're not going think, how are we going to fill all this time? But of course, once you get academics talking, we don't stop, do we? Everybody, we love it. So, right, by going last, I suppose, yeah, I'll introduce the things that it said on the list here. So I'm a senior lecturer at a university in England, at Canterbury Christ Church University, and it's not a particularly research-focused university. We're not a Russell Group university. My position isn't based on getting research funding, although, you know, if we do want to progress, if we want to be promoted, especially through the sort of reader and professor stream rather than principal lecturer and then sort of teaching professor stream, then yes, we are expected to apply for and to try and get research funding. Now, obviously, Timothy and Paolo, you both discussed, you know, the problems of like the negative aspects of applying for funding and the fact that you don't get it, you know, out of, you know, I don't know how many, I don't know what the statistics are for how many research bids you have to put in to actually get funding out. But certainly, as both of you were saying, you know, my experience is in the last few years that, you know, you don't get all the funding you applied for. I was like noting things down. This year, I applied for funding from Jean Monnet Fund for module funding, so that through Erasmus Plus, I applied for ISRF for a sort of medium-sized grant, and I applied to the UK Space Agency for a project that would take in working with schools, working, you know, it's a multidisciplinary project working with teachers, working with engineers and scientists, trying to get children interested in space and science as more than just a STEM subject. So showing them that, you know, there's political and legal sides to space as well. So there's like all these career opportunities. Now, none of those were funded. Okay, so the Jean Monnet funding, I see not nearly as many people in the UK got Jean Monnet funding as previously. However, that had been put into my appraisal last year as something that I had to apply for nonetheless, even though it looked fairly unlikely that we would either be able to apply for it or anybody would get it if we did manage to apply for it. The UK Space Agency said that they were very interested in the project, but they only had the money to fund, I think it was only one project in the end, and there'd been about 80 applications for it. So the amount of applications that go in for each one are huge. And that one had a lot because it was for teaching and outreach, which those of you who are involved in the British system and in the REF know that anything that can have that kind of actual impact for academics is really important. So there was a lot of people going for that as well. The ISRF one, my feedback was just the standard feedback of, you know, very nice, but not this time. Yeah, the Jean Monnet one, I have to say, I was half a point below funding, which was quite upsetting. But they take a very long time to fill in. And what I really wanted to talk to you about today is my experience of the institutional difficulties, because I think this isn't something that we look at so much. And perhaps it's not something that those of you at the more research focused universities actually experience. But we have institutions, what feel like almost we're asked to apply for research funding, and yet when it comes down to it, we do not have the experience in applying to the big research councils, not the social research councils anyway. We have research funding offices, we have research development and enterprise office, but they're very much focused on dealing with, it's the health, medical and health service provisions that they deal with. So they're used to dealing with NHS contracts, they're used to dealing with private contracts in health and healthcare. They do not have the experience of going through the ESRC or Leverhulme or any of the big social research councils, which does make it quite difficult. So we don't have that help in terms of writing it or no, just the experience in filling in the forms, because as you were saying, Timothy, and I think, Paolo, you went into this as well, each application is different. They're not something that can just be, you know, like a journal article, we just go, oh, it was rejected there, I'll send it somewhere else. Each application really is very different. And there isn't necessarily that acknowledgement within the research, our research office. There's not the institutional knowledge that says, well, this is how we can convert it into this. They very much expect us as academics to know exactly what to do there. Now, the next problem I've had institutionally, you know how long it takes to write a research bid. I've had these then go to senior management to be told it's not the right sort of money, that we don't want that sort of bid. We don't want that sort of thing to go ahead because, you know, how are we going to fill your teaching if you get that? I say, well, we should be filling the teaching with, if I get it, the money will come from the research bid. Oh, well, that's not the right sort of money. We can't put that into teaching if it's a research bid. So I have been right at the very end of applying for money to be told that this isn't the kind of research bid that we want to go forward, when that wasn't made clear before I put, you know, the weeks of effort into applying for it. So this is a sort of, I would say, like a lack of institutional experience, and a lack of ability to swap pots of money around. You know, how do we make our, not just, you know, how do we make the research bids look worthwhile to the research funders, but also to our own institutions, say that this is actually worthwhile, and that, you know, how can it be the wrong sort of money? If it's going into the wrong pot, then that's an institutional issue. Surely that isn't an issue with the research funding body that I'm going through. So that's been something that I find really difficult, actually, is dealing with my own institution in terms of the grants. Well, you know, and not even once you get the grants. I have had, as we said before, I've had a research grant from the Independent Social Research Fund in the last few years, which, as we say, as Timothy pointed out, that is a sort of pure research body. They're not asking for a huge amount of outreach. They're not asking for a huge amount of impact. They say that they will fund small academic projects. In fact, they go up to, I applied for a medium-sized one again last year, but I think it was 3 or 4 years ago I got this small grant. It wasn't a lot of money. It was meant to be enough to buy me out of one module so that I would have less teaching and I could actually backload my teaching. So it would mean I could get research, basically a term of research leave to carry out a project on international political economy and space. And that was funded by the ISRF, and it was agreed that I could backload my teaching and buy myself out of this module. However, because I'd backloaded my teaching and been bought out of one module, I was put onto other modules to teach that semester. So I ended up without any leave at all to do my research. Of course, I got, you know, then you're left in the position of, well, I don't want to end up with research bodies feeling that I can't complete projects, and so just working double time to ensure that that is carried out. So it's the institutional issues that I've faced have been really quite difficult in terms of funding, and not, you know, over and above, and perhaps more difficult than gaining funding itself is dealing with it, like applying for it and not having the help, getting things written and then being told that it's not in the priorities of the university, and then getting funding and not being given the time to actually carry the funding out, which has all been really quite tricky, really, in terms of institutional, rather a lack of institutional encouragement, I would say, but at the same time, institutional pressure to get that funding there. So pressure versus lack of understanding about how difficult it is and how it can be managed when it is brought through. So it can be really difficult at different institutions to get that that support. I see Timothy's got his hand up there, so I'll hand over.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, I guess the key message is, if we want to put it slightly different, look at own context first and look at the university you're based in, the research center you're based in or you're affiliated with, and look what the aims, what the strategy of the institution is for the next years first, and look if there is a service department that basically can help you to interpret any grant scheme from the very beginning. From a more institutional bureaucratic point of view, and then obviously look for people to discuss the research idea before starting to getting into weeks of writing up the idea.
As well, you have to make sure, because of course I've always done that, made sure it's been discussed through with my direct line managers, my head of school. But it has to be very much, understood that even if all those boxes have been ticked, other boxes can always appear later on, I would say.
Yeah, true. No, I fully agree. Thank you very much for your very personal also insights into this topic, and for basically outlining these practical difficulties in writing up research grant proposals. Timofey, you had your hand on. I'll hand over to you, but I also invite the audience basically to come in with questions and with comments. So we might have persons who have some ideas to share as well in the audience. Timofey.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Look, I think what we hear clearly from Sarah, there needs to be, before you, to all of you listening in, you might have an excellent idea, you might have invested a lot of time in writing up your proposal, it might be a good proposal and fitting well with the grant giver, whatever else. We need to always be cautious about the background conditions from which we apply. So in Sarah's case, clearly that's an indication that institutional support is critical. You need to be have a backing of your department or whatever the institution is called when you apply, to ensure that you can actually digest the funding that you receive. So having applied for grant, institution might need to reconsider how it is going to spend it, whether it's putting it into a teaching buyout or a supportive research team, postdocs, for that matter. But I think for many people interested in the conversation here, it is who are not in the position at the university, or not in a permanent position. Many of these avenues are foreclosed, so ISRF might be open to some of the participants here in the panel, or the attendees of the panel, but not the ones, the likes of Leverhulme Trust or ESRC or whatever have you. The political foundations are again an exception there. You can go there all the time. I think in that sense, for the part of the audience who's on the lookout how to access research funding, I think, Paolo, I'll bring you in there as well. I think both research councils and larger trusts rely on academics who are already embedded in the higher education in UK to apply. But in all of those applications in research councils and in trusts, you can put, or academics can put in for research assistant, postdoc, or PhD student. This has been the case with my ESRC project and with my application to Leverhulme Trust now, and with Roundtree Foundation as well. So if you are a young career researcher, if you are looking for a place to work and you have an excellent idea, do not be afraid of approaching academics who might be working in the field that you are covering, who might also be interested in the idea that you are putting forward to them. They will be your mentors, they will be supporting your research, they will be applying with you, and if you are mentioned on the project, and you will be employed employed to work on that project in case that is successful. So this is an implicit encouragement for all of you young career researchers to reach out to those who are more or less established, who are more or less open, who have the capacity to share their knowledge and wisdom, and institutional capacity to bring you on board and give you an opportunity to work from a UK, in that case, the research institution for a few years while the project is running, because that's one of the ways, one of the beauties of those funders research schemes is that you can come in with a research project of your own, but once the application has been okayed, you can do whatever you want. You have to deliver on something, but whether there is a major shift in the research focus or not, this is largely irrelevant for the funder. The funder has made a decision that this area of research is important and useful, and there is effectively you as a researcher participating in the project can drive your research agenda whichever direction you want. So this is effectively a very useful way to engage in your own clear sky thinking, even if the project framework doesn't allow for that. But in any case, I think this is one key message from all of these discussions here. But the second one, I think, and again, reiterating the importance of considering applying for research grants for young career academics, is that on the one hand, obviously, you do have your own research profile that you would like, your research focus that you're trying to pursue. But as we all have mentioned, there are clear parameters in all these research grants that you need to fit yourself into. That might look scary and discouraging to a degree, but I think my experience in all of this is these fixed parameters of research funding allow you to look at your own research idea from a slightly different angle and allow you to actually plug in your maybe relevant but not central research for that fund in their funding stream, and liaise with others who might be informing your research expertise in the longer run. So allowing you to profile yourself in that sense better over time as the projects run. I'll leave with this. Maybe there are comments from the floor. Maybe Paolo, maybe you could chip in and say about your experience of hiring postdocs or creating positions for younger researchers, since
there is, Timofey, thank you. I second all what you said, because actually it's also the approach Iraq Research adopts. So it has several institutes with several more experienced scholars, and it obviously supports younger researchers by feeding them in different schemes. They might be locally funded, and so your concern should also include, let's say, the case study of South Tyrol. But just to throw it out there, we also have the project development service. For example, FIORC Research also supports a Marie Curie training week, where people get invited if they want to write up a Marie Curie individual fellowship grant proposal. So this you can find information on this on the different websites of the institutions, and just do contact the single scholars working in the field, as Timofey said. That's always very promising. I have one request from the audience to come in with a question or with a comment, and I would invite Mahmoud to do so, and then I'll ask everybody for a very short final comment, basically on the question what each of you would change, if you could, in the research access funding mechanisms, except from the fact, obviously, of increasing funding, which we all want to have. So, Mahmoud, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. Thanks to all the panelists for their insights. This is really helpful. I have two questions. My first is, so if the rate of rejection is very high, what to do after rejection? So do you receive feedback from the research funders on your proposal that you can use to improve your grad before submitting it to somewhere else, or what to do after to avoid the degree of recyclability that Paolo mentioned in his intervention? And my second question is, for those grants that aim to advance scientific knowledge, what to do about research outputs? Do you, from your experience, do funders or donors have preferences for books over journal articles? Where to put these research outputs on your plan? Do they require that you have at least one publication while you are doing your research, or can it be after you have already can publication happen after once you have already finished finish the grant in the post grant phase? Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Excellent. So we'll obviously take your questions, and I will hand over to the panelists for the final round, which will address these questions and give a final statement. If this is fine with the organizers, I guess we go with this. Let's keep the same order, or Timothy, you wanna close up, or okay? So let's do the reverse order, and I'll invite basically Sarah to be the first speaker.
Okay, your questions, Mahmoud. In terms of feedback, it very much depends on the body that you've applied to. So some will give you very detailed feedback on you know, why you didn't get it, you know, was there an issue with the budget? I've had feedback saying that I'd put down to go to too many conferences, and so they weren't sure whether it was good management of the budget. I've had, you know, so coming right the way down to specifics about what's in the budget and exactly what you're going to do. But then I've also had feedback that is incredibly non-specific, as I said, just saying, thank you very much for your application, you've not been successful. So they vary hugely, and what you can do with that feedback varies hugely as well. As I said, I had very detailed feedback from the UK Space Agency on the project that I was hoping, that I applied for funding for in January, February of this year. But it's not a project that would be easy to find funding for otherwise, because it was a very specific call for a multidisciplinary project that would involve outreach with different school age groupings. So in fact, I was working with them until lockdown, because they were still interested in being involved in the project, and they had other ideas for different funders. So it can be worthwhile asking the funding body that you've been working with or have applied to, especially if it's something very specific like that. It's a tricky one. So they were happy to sort of work with me and my sort of co-applicants to look at other bodies that might fund a similar project, because it was a very specific project. So it can be quite difficult to use that feedback to make the application better if it was a very specific project in the first place to that funding body. Am I to round off now as well? Yeah, in terms of rounding off, I mean, it's part of our academic job applying for funding, isn't it? And the joy, I think, at submitting a funding proposal is always fantastic. I always become very excited at the idea of doing the project, of perhaps getting the funding. And I think you begin to live with not even the disappointment. You have to not take it as a disappointment. You just have to live with the fact that you don't always get the funding. It's not about receiving the funding necessarily. It is about the process of working through a research proposal and deciding what it might be you would like to do next. And, you know, it's in the, you know, we have to assume that the pleasure's in the chase, not always in catching the funding, because if we were dependent on that, then I think we'd become very disappointed people, and perhaps academia wouldn't be the area for us. I'm not saying it's a perfect system, because I'm sure there's ways that it could be improved, but I'm not sure what those are. It's just part of our job, in the same way that it's very, very, very rare to have a journal article just accepted without any changes, isn't it? When was the last time anybody received 2 reviewers on a journal article saying, yeah, perfect, just hand it in as it is? It doesn't happen. And so that is the way of academic life. These things, we shouldn't take them as disappointments. We just have to take them as part of our job, I would say.
Thanks, Sarah. Ada.
Right. Yeah, what can I say? I thought of following up on Mahmoud's question about feedback and some of what Sarah just said there. I think coming from the perspective of the other side, I would like to be able, kind of in a better world, I'd like to be able to spend more time on providing feedback to applicants, because actually we are approached constantly with a lot of really high quality applications on all sorts of projects, and it is a disappointment for ourselves as well not to be able to fund all of them, but to make a decision on a variety of in response to certain factors and interests. And perhaps the other thing that I would like to see more is in terms of what comes after results have been provided to stakeholders, and to foster that exchange between researchers and stakeholders, also in the mid to long term, and not just as a one-way thing. And I think we all can work on that, especially obviously on our side, on the side of the funders. Thank you.
Okay, so quickly on the feedback. Well, I must say that in my experience, you rarely get sort of helpful feedback, to be honest. I mean, for certain, it varies enormously between funders. For certain schemes, you don't get anything at all, zero. For others, you get, for the SSC, for example, you get the reviews, sort of the reports from the reviewers. In some cases, those are maybe helpful. In other cases, they are less helpful because people just, well, whatever, it's a long story. But basically, it varies a lot. So in some cases, yes, it is useful. In other cases, either it is not useful or not very useful, or you don't get anything at all. So it does vary a lot. In terms of whether there is a preference for article or books, well, I guess, again, it depends on, which country, which, academic system you're operating with. In the UK, generally speaking, let's say Western Europe, North America, increasingly articles are important rather than books. That doesn't mean the books are not important. Obviously a research monograph with a prestigious university press is still very important, but not necessarily preferred compared to an article in a highly ranked journal. In terms of whether you need to have publications before you apply, well, that I would say is helpful, in the sense that one of the criteria that the funders will look at in deciding whether to award the funding or not is the sort of the degree of promise in academic terms of the applicant. And I mean, obviously, if you are more advanced in the career, they look at your track record. If you are in the early stage of your career, you need to show potential. Now, potential, of course, can be shown by, again, sort of track record in terms of a master's degree and so on. But when you get to the PhD, when you get to the end of the PhD, essentially potential is shown by at least one publication in a good journal, because that that signals that you have the ability to produce high quality research, and that then you can show that you are able to do that. That particular project. Okay, so I would say that is helpful, and I would say at least one publication in a good journal then is a very important signal in terms of your potential as a researcher. So I think that would help. I mean, on what I would change, but that would take another panel. So I will not say virtually anything about that. What I would say in terms of just the final piece of advice is that two pieces of advice. I mean, the first one, don't rush your applications. grant application, they take a long time. That's why they're frustrating, as Sarah was saying, because you spend a lot of time on them and then they get turned down most of the time. But there is no way around it. They do take time, almost like, the same time that you spend, on writing a, journal article. I mean, so they do take time. Don't rush them, because that is not going to work. And the second one is to get internal feedback from, from colleagues, from if there is an internal panel or some description in your institution, or, some other feedback that you can get from people that can help you. That is usually very, very helpful in terms of raising, your chances. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. I would like to thank all the panelists before I hand over to Timofey for the very closing remarks. I would like to thank you all for the insights you gave in reference with your personal experiences, in reference with the country you live in or the work funding environment you're in. And now I do hand over to Timofey and thank him for inviting me to this roundtable. I enjoyed guiding us through this roundtable, and I think it was a brilliant possibility to share views on how to try to access as much research funds as we can. Timofey, the floor is yours for.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, as well, for moderating. All of you, Paolo, Sara, Ada, for contributing. Yeah, I'm in a strange position. I'm a participant in the roundtable, also rounding up. So I think, in summary and in encouragement, I think I'd like to repeat a few things that have been said before. It is one of them: accessing research funding is not easy. But it's not just, it should not be seen as a discouragement. See this as part of your research process that is helpful for identifying what it is that you have to say, or what you can say to wider audiences, whether it is a colleagues or those practitioners we are talking about, political foundations. At the same time, as with all the research, it does take time to let germinate and come out as a well-conceived project application. So do take your time to seek advice of senior colleagues. And my tip of the day is seek senior colleagues who could apply with you, because maybe that would also hit the two bases at one in response to Mahmoud's question about what kind of publications you need, what kind of evidence you need to showcase whether you are able to deliver on your promise. Core applications are usually much better in that, because there will be someone who can cover one part of the promise and you cover the other one. And ultimately, I think one of the discouraging parts of the messages here is that the success rates are really low. So whoever Mahmoud was asking this, if we're thinking of 1/10 of all project applications being funded, that's only an optimistic assessment. One of the applications that I have had turned down just 2 days ago went into the pool with 3,000 applications, and only 50 would be funded. So you can calculate. I'm not that good at maths. What's the percentage of success rate there? But in all of this, I think the encouragement would be to persevere and try again. And taking the words of Paolo's, make sure that whatever you're applying for is, on one hand, building on your strength and avoid weaknesses that your CV, your experience might showcase. And second, make sure that it is sufficiently forward-looking, so that it's not a one-off application, which, in other words, that it is to say that the application should be in a way recyclable, so it can be turned around, and maybe you don't mention multi-level governance as a title of it, but maybe you will be looking at a federal reform or devolution in whatever country. So making it flexible enough but specific enough is key, I think, to success. And with all of that, Thank you and good luck. All the best, and thank you all for participating in the panel. All the best. It was good seeing you, Paolo, Sara, Elizabeth, Ada. Bye now.